Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a very special seminar on the Paris Peace Agreements. It's a redo of the one I did a month ago because I did it on no sleep. It was not coherent, and this is for greater clarity and for emphasis as well. But before we go and dive into the content, let's take a 30-second break to grab coffee, to grab pen and pencil, and we meet in 30 seconds. See you in 30 seconds. Good morning again. Welcome to my home in Kinswai this Wednesday morning in Phnom Penh or near Phnom Penh, just on the outskirts of Phnom Penh. This special seminar is for Cambodian friends, Cambodian watchers, for Cambodians in the diaspora who aren't too fluent in Khmer. This is a seminar for you. So invite your friends and please share. It's for a very broad audience, not just for local Cambodians. This is why it's in English. This is a very special seminar on the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia of October 23, 1991, on the very special occasion of its 30th anniversary, which occurred 1 month ago. But this is a redo of a seminar because, again, I did it on no sleep and for greater clarity, coherency, and for emphasis. So let's dive right into the context. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Again, welcome. So we're speaking about the Paris Peace Agreement, what is generally known as the Paris Agreement or Paris Peace Agreement, sometimes with an S, because there are 4 parts to it. The fuller name is the Comprehensive Political Settlement on the Cambodia Conflict. We continue. When we speak about the Paris Agreements of 1991, there are 2 major events that we're focusing on. One of them you know really well. The whole world knows about the first event, or not event, period, era, and that's the Khmer Rouge years. So the Paris Peace Accord or Paris Peace Agreement addresses the Khmer Rouge years, the Khmer Rouge era of April 17, 1975 to the end of December 1978, beginning or January 1979. 3 years, 8 months, 20 days. Very ingrained in the minds of Cambodians, Cambodian watchers, historians, those who are following issues of genocide of Cambodia generally. So that's very well known, that time period, not only among Cambodians, but among the world. There are films, well, we address that. But the second um, era is not well known or known at all. And actually, it's the impetus. It's even more of an impetus for the Paris peace agreements. And that era is the military occupation of Cambodia, which occurred immediately after the Khmer Rouge era, because Vietnam invaded Cambodia and ended the Khmer Rouge regime and stayed and occupied Cambodia. And Vietnam would be here to this day, and there would be no Cambodia to this day if it had not been for the Paris Peace Agreement. Thus, the Paris Peace Agreement, the impetus for the Paris Peace Agreement is the years, almost 14 years, effectively 14 years of military occupation of Cambodia by Vietnam. I know most of you may be in shock right now. It's not well known, and I address some of the reasons why that is. But when we speak about the Paris Peace Accord or the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia of 1991, the primary impetus for this agreement is the Vietnamese military occupation of Cambodia, which took place from January 7, 1979, and effectively to May 1993, when the United Nations intervened by organizing a democratic elections, effectively almost 14 years. Thus, the Paris Peace Agreements. When we will look at some of the language of the agreement, which clearly says this, which concludes that the impetus, the main reason for the establishment of the Paris Peace Agreement is the 14 years of Vietnamese military occupation, or then 12 to 14 years. And of course, on issues of human rights, on democracy, it also addresses the era of the Khmer Rouge. We continue. So why is it not well known? Why don't you know this? Why is it that we think that the Paris Peace Agreement addresses solely the Khmer Rouge era, which occurred prior to the Vietnamese military occupation and for a shorter period of time? Well, the first reason is that all the resources in English, and that's what we read, and the chatter class, the individuals with influence to pass on information, to drive and guide how a narrative. Well, those individuals normally are English speakers, English writers, English readers. They are readers, they're speakers of English. So all the resources are about the Khmer Rouge. And when we're talking about resources, we're talking about books, history books, and just look at the image that I have that I have made to your right. So there are literally no book on the 14 years of the Vietnamese military occupation in the English language. There may be in another language, but I highly doubt it. And there are zillions of books now on the Khmer Rouge years, and there are also many more books on the previous mass crimes of the U.S. carpet bombing, which is really not addressed by the Khmer Rouge, not the Khmer Rouge, by the Paris Peace Agreement. Thus, I only focus on the two tragedies, the Khmer Rouge era and the Vietnamese military occupation. My point is that we don't know that the Paris Peace Agreement was established in response primarily to the Vietnamese military occupation of Cambodia. And of course, it also addresses the Khmer Rouge era. We don't know that, one, because there are no resources in books, in films, in art, no resources on this period, and all the resources are on the Khmer Rouge years. So that's the first main reason. The second main reason, can you pull up the page a little bit? I forgot what I have written there. Oh, the second main reason is the intentional manipulation by Vietnam to cast Cambodians as racist solely based on one word, Yuan. Yuan, prior to recent time, is the only word that Cambodians know for Vietnamese. And it's a neutral word. The Thai, the people of Thailand, use the exact same word. In the Cambodian language, prior to recent days, it's the only way we call a Vietnamese, in a neutral way, without any racist tone in it. Of course, racism can stem from through other means, but not based on that word. Anyway, but we have been charged based solely on that word through Vietnamese manipulation and effective lobbying and propaganda, the dissemination of this narrative that we are racist toward them solely based on the use of this one word. And that narrative has been perpetuated by everyone, unthinkingly, unwittingly. And of course, with the charge of racism, all of a sudden, the discussion is closed. It effectively stymied any conversation on Vietnamization of Cambodia. So that's the second main reason why people don't know about the occupation years, because we can't speak about it to foreigners. Of course, we speak about it among ourselves. The Cambodians speak about it, but we don't have the influence to shape the narrative for the international community. So that's the second reason. The third reason, can you pull up the image again? I have to let me just, oh. The third reason is because all the survivors of, not all, the survivors of the Khmer Rouge who have influence with the international community because they speak English, they perpetuate the narrative by focusing on the Khmer Rouge years, because that's what they experienced. Unintentional, unwittingly bolstering the narrative of seeing only the Khmer Rouge, having the Khmer Rouge conversation dominate everything else about recent history of Cambodia. It subsumes the conversation about the Khmer Rouge, consumes, dominates every other elements of the occupation years, because the survivors of the Khmer Rouge who have escaped to a third country, who are speaking English and conversing with the international community in English, they're speaking of their personal experience about the Khmer Rouge, because they hardly ever lived, except for maybe 1 year, the first year, like I did during the occupation years of 1979. And during that time, we had no information to even address the mass crimes. We knew that it was horrible, but we didn't know the details and the policies behind the horrible condition of 1979. Only in hindsight did we know. So the second reason is that the why we don't know about the occupation years by the Vietnamese military, because the Cambodian survivors living in the diaspora, speaking English, are focusing on their own experience and of living under the horror of the Khmer Rouge. So it even expands that narrative, that focus to of the Khmer Rouge to dominate any other conversation about Cambodian recent history, in particular the occupation years. And two, because they never or hardly lived under it, to understand the impact on their personal experience is not discussed. So unwittingly, the Cambodian survivors of the Khmer Rouge who are living in third countries in the diaspora. The second, visitors to Cambodia and foreign writers, non-Cambodian writers on Cambodia solely, almost solely focus on the Khmer Rouge years, because there are a lot of resources that they can research and write about. And then, of course, the visitors to Cambodia perpetuate that narrative by reading their writings and continue to recycle what has been wrongly, or not wrongly, the imbalanced, unproportional focus, not an unproportional, just solely on the Khmer Rouge years. So, and I'm going to mention another reason later. There are many other reasons, but these are the I'll mention it now. The fourth is the U.S. fatigue on Southeast Asia after the U.S.-Vietnam War, which the U.S. lost, and didn't focus and pay attention on Southeast Asia. Thus, there were no news coverage during the occupation years, really, in comparison to the Vietnam War and those years. So from a lot of attention to almost zero attention after the U.S. left Southeast Asia and never looked back until recently. So those are the reasons why we don't know about the Vietnamese military occupation, which is the impetus for the Paris Peace Agreement, because the conversations, all the resources have been dominated, have been consumed by the focus on the Khmer Rouge years. Okay, we continue. When we discuss the Paris Peace Agreement, or agreements with an S, we are focusing on the end of the Cold War years. So the Khmer Rouge, I keep saying the Khmer Rouge, of course, the Khmer Rouge era did occur within the Cold War context and the Vietnamese military occupation as well. I wanted to say the Paris Peace Agreement on Cambodia emerged from the Cold War context. And as you know, the Cold War began almost immediately after World War II with the Truman Doctrine in 1947 and ended in December 1991 with the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the last 2 years, 1989, was the beginning of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the thawing of the Cold War, which opened up a way for the political settlement on Cambodia to begin discussions by the international community. All to say, the Paris Peace Agreement emerged or occurred toward the very end, 2 months before the Cold War completely ended in December 1991. The Paris Peace Agreement occurred in October of that year. And the Cold War is geopolitical tension between the free world, represented by the United States, and the communist world, represented then by the Soviet Union, and had two phases. We go to the next slide. It had two phases. The first phase was from the very beginning, in 1947 to around 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. But the Paris Peace Agreement, the Khmer Rouge era, the Vietnamese military occupation occurred in the second phase of the Cold War, when there was tension and conflict within the communist bloc, within the Eastern communist bloc, between the two major superpowers of communism, the Soviet and China. And it played out in Southeast Asia. So one of the political theaters, the main political theater of the Cold War years in the second phase, occurred in mainland Southeast Asia, mainly the US-Vietnam War. And of course, that war spilled into Cambodia. And the reason for the US intervention in Vietnam was their fear of the domino effect, believing that if one communist country falls to, believing that if South Vietnam, then Vietnam were two countries, North Communist Vietnam, South Free, not non-communist South Vietnam. If South Vietnam falls to communism, then other countries in the region will also fall like a domino. It will have that effect. Thus, the U.S. presence in mainland Southeast Asia, and the Vietnamese War with the U.S. spilled into Cambodia, which unleashed the war power of the United States in the carpet bombings of Cambodia prior to the Khmer Rouge, and is one of the reasons for the power and the furor of the Khmer Rouge. We go on. The two main individuals associated with the end of the Cold War years are US President Ronald Reagan, who led for who won two terms during the whole of the 1980s, meaning during the whole, or his 8 years in office at the White House were the years of the Vietnamese military occupation. And as you know, he hated communism, and the Vietnamese were a communist power in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge was communist, and the Vietnamese that invaded and ended the Khmer Rouge and occupied Cambodia after the Khmer Rouge are communist and military power. But Ronald Reagan hated communism with a passion, and he was responsible as leader of the free world for ending the Cold War, alongside his counterpart in the Soviet Union, the other symbol, the other leader of the Cold War years in the Eastern Communist Bloc. So Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Secretary General, the chief of the Soviet Communist Party, ascribed to perestroika, the opening up of the Soviet Union, which led to its dissolution into many different countries. Many of them became free countries. Many continue to be communist, like Russia, for example. So Russia took over the seat of the Soviet Union in the UN Security Council as a permanent member. But those are the two individuals responsible for ending the Cold War years. The Cold War, the Soviet Union started to crumble in 1989, and then it completely dissolved. The world no longer had a Soviet Union in December 1991. The woman in the middle is Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick. She served under Ronald Reagan as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. She was busy negotiating and advocating for the military occupation of Cambodia to end at the United Nations, along with many other countries, in particular, all the founding members of ASEAN then. And the founding members of ASEAN then were Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia. The U.S. led the struggle for the Vietnamese to leave Cambodia against the Vietnamese military occupation in the United Nations. So the United Nations was busy on the Cambodia topic for that whole decade, and then years later, ending with UNTAC, with the United Nations organized elections in Cambodia in May 1993. Jean Kirkpatrick was also my professor at Georgetown. I had her in a seminar of about 40 to 60 individuals, and she and I went to the same church in Bethesda, Fourth Presbyterian Church. Madeleine Albright was also a professor at Georgetown during the time that I was a student there. And she was appointed by Bill Clinton to be the first, not the first. She followed Jean Kirkpatrick to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations when I was a student there. I didn't have her for a professor, Madeleine Albright, because by the time that I could, because she was teaching senior courses, and by the time that I was in my second or third or fourth year, the schedule didn't work out. Anyway, so those are the two individuals, and Jean Kirkpatrick was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations during the time of the Cold War years relating to the Paris Peace Agreement, the decade before the 1991 Paris Peace Accord. We go on. When we speak about the Paris Peace Agreement or agreements on Cambodia, we are focusing on 4 parts of 4 documents, thus sometimes the S at the end of agreement. But now I'm going to go with what the United Nations has on its website. So these are 2 screenshots I gleaned from the website of the United Nations in recent days, which has links to the Paris Peace Agreement in about 6 or 7 languages, 4 of them official language of the Paris Peace Agreement. But when we speak about the Paris Peace Agreement, which is a general term, we're focusing on 4 documents. And the title of the 4 documents are, the first is the final act of the Paris Conference on Cambodia. And we will look a little bit at that document briefly. The second and the third document are the heart, the core of the Paris Peace Agreement. Generally, the second document is entitled Agreement on the Comprehensive Political Settlement of the Cambodia Conflict. That's lengthy and it has a table of contents. So we will look at the subtitles at the table of contents of this lengthy second document, about 20 pages. The third document, the core of the Paris Peace Agreement is entitled Agreement Concerning the Sovereignty, Independence, Territorial Integrity, and Inviolability, Neutrality, and National Unity of Cambodia. Whew, a mouthful. It's like a paragraph long. But that's the official title of one of the four documents that form the Paris Peace Agreement. That's the official title. It's like a paragraph long. And the fourth document of that form, what we generally call the Paris Peace Agreement, is the Declaration on the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction of Cambodia. So those are the four documents. Together, they form the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement, the Paris Peace Agreements of Cambodia of 1991. There are four parts, four documents to the Paris Peace Accord. The second screenshot has links to all the languages which have translated this Paris Peace Agreement on Cambodia of 1991. So it's in English, in Chinese, in French, in Russian, the four official languages of this agreement, but it's also in Arabic, it's also in Spanish. Amazingly, incredibly, it's not in Khmer because we never got our act together in producing an official translation of this agreement that involved the whole world, the superpowers of the world, on Cambodia, but it's not in the Khmer language officially because our translation and our language is so problematic. There's only one version in Khmer prior to my version, and that has several key translation errors. The first major error of the only version not official in the Khmer language translated the first document, the final acts on the Paris Conference on Cambodia, as the final agreement, making it as if it's the core of the Paris Agreement. It's not. It's only a description. And it placed that final act, which all the other translations has as the first document. The Cambodian version, the old version prior to my version, put it at the very end. One, it translated the title wrong. It translated final act as agreement when it's really a description of what happened, acts as in activities. Of course, act sometimes is translated as law, as agreements, but not in this case. It's very clear that the final act on the Paris Peace Conference, on the Paris Conference, is a description of the activities. ACT stands for activities of that last day, not the final agreement, making it as if it's the substance of the whole agreement. And of course, upon reading it, we know right away that it's not the case. All to say, it's been really problematic because for 30 years, Cambodians had no readable, comprehensible translation in our language to read a major treaty, international agreement on Cambodia. It's really incredible. So for the 30th anniversary, I worked off with a translator I worked off with the old version and with the help of Google, did my own translation and my own version. And it took a lot of time. So now we have I would like to say a more high quality version, because I do know both languages really well, and plus I'm a student of international politics and I'm a lawyer by training. We move on. So just to give you a sense of what the actual agreement looks like, that is on the UN website in about 6, 7 languages. All the major languages of the world have translated this international agreement, international treaty involving on Cambodia. So this is in English. So the first on the website is a cover letter addressing the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, and it may be from the Office of the Secretariat, representing the UN Secretary General. This is not part of the substance of the Paris Agreement, but it's a cover letter informing now, presenting the formal agreements in all these different languages to the UN Security Council, to the UN General Assembly. So this is the first page. We go on. This is now the first document. We move on. We go on. Next slide. Can we go on to the next slide? There may be some technical issues. My special assistant, can you hear me? Can we go on to the next slide? Can we go on to the next slide? Can you hear me? I'm trying to show you the actual form of the Paris Peace Agreement. You can see the font was very, very different. And now they're living in cyberspace in present time in the UN website, and all these languages are in the UN website. Hello, can we move back to, there may be technical issues. But you can see that why sometimes we use Paris Agreement and sometimes we use Paris Agreements, because there are 4 documents and the middle 2 are the core, and in their title, it begins with agreements on the comprehensive political settlement on Cambodia and agreements concerning sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity and inviolability, neutrality, and national unity of Cambodia. So these 2 are the core, this being the lengthiest, more lengthy. And we will look at the table of contents once we have the PowerPoint working again. Okay, so we saw the cover letter of the cover letter presenting the actual 4 parts of the agreement to the UN General Assembly, to the UN Secretary, to the UN Security Council. But now, so that's the 1 page, one cover letter. Now we're going into the substance, into the actual 4 parts, 4 documents that form the Paris Accord. The first is entitled Final Act of the Paris Conference on Cambodia. So this is a description. So then we go to the second document. We move on. The second document, this is from the UN website. When you click on English, and on the different languages which have translated the Paris Agreement, and now we're looking at the English version. This is what you see. So the second document, or the second part of the Paris Agreement, is entitled, notice the term agreement in its name, Agreement on a Comprehensive Political Settlement of the Cambodia Conflict. We move on. Next. The third document, which is the heart of the Paris Agreement, has in its title, the title of Agreement Concerning the Sovereignty, Independence, Territorial Integrity and Inviolability, Neutrality and National Unity of Cambodia. So that's the title of the third part, or the third document of the Paris Agreement. We move on. Next. The fourth document has the title Declaration on the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction of Cambodia. Okay, so now this is what you would find if you click on English in the link of the United Nations to the Paris Peace Agreement. Next. Okay, now we're going to start looking at some of the languages of the first part, or the first document, the final act of the Paris Conference of Cambodia, which has been translated wrongly in the Khmer language in the only version prior to my version as the final agreement. No, act in this sense is activities. What happens during the last day, October 23 of 1991. Now, all the different important elements. So it's a description. Okay, so let's look at the some of the languages. Next. So this is the actual language of the first part of the first document, which is a description, the final act of the Paris Conference. Now, so I'm going to pull the screen closer, so maybe you don't need to see me because I need to read. So and it has just point 1, point 2, point 3. It doesn't have article 1, article 2, because it's just a description. So point 1, this is the actual language. The conference was held in 2 sessions. The first from July 30 to August 30, 1989. Remember, the Cold War was thawing. The Soviet Union, who was financing its satellite, Vietnam, in Cambodia, the Soviet Union was breaking up. So it opens, there was a political opening to start peace talks on Cambodia. And the second session was from 21 to 23 October 1991, and it was signed on October 23, 1991. Thus, we have that date. So you notice that it came into being, the agreement came into being because of the larger political feasibility. The Soviet Union was thawing. The Cold War was thawing. The Soviet Union was dissolving, was breaking up in 1989. It completely dissolved in December 1991. And so during those 2 sessions, the beginning and the end, it allowed for further backroom discussions and talks to finally come up with the Paris Accord, or Paris Agreement. I forgot to mention that during the Cold War, when the Soviet and the Chinese were in conflict during the second phase, the Soviet had its proxies and the Chinese Communist had its proxies. As I said, it played out in mainland Southeast Asia. In the Vietnam War, it spilled into Cambodia. And so in Cambodia, the Soviet was financing its proxy, Vietnam, to occupy Cambodia. And the Chinese had always supported the Khmer Rouge, its proxy. Thus, the geopolitical nature of the conflict, and the background for the Paris Accord. So let's continue looking at the language of the first document now, the final act, which is the description of what went on, that produced the agreements. So we're looking at the conference. Point two, the co-presidents of the conference were Roland Dumas, Minister for Foreign Affairs of France, and Ali Alatas, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. Very important, Indonesia was one of the 5 founding countries of ASEAN. It's the largest democracy in the region. And France was a former was the former imperialist power in Cambodia. Cambodia was a colony of France. Thus, the 2 co-presidents, one from the West, one from the region. Very important for the international and regional security that the Paris Agreement addresses. Point 3, the following states participated in the conference: Australia, Brunei, Cambodia, Canada, China, France, India, Indonesia, Japan, Laos, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, USSR, the Soviet Union, the United Nations, and the United Kingdom, the United States, Vietnam. Notice all the members, all the permanent members of the UN Security Council participated, and all the founding members of ASEAN, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines were involved, and the other nations in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, except for Burma, Brunei was involved, and there was no East Timor, Timor-Leste then, were involved. And notice also the other superpowers: Japan, Australia, Canada, France. This is an international treaty, an international agreement that it actively involved the superpowers, all the permanent members of the UN Security Council, all the founding members of ASEAN, etc. Very important to understand which countries were involved, which reflect the significance, the gravitas of this agreement. The non-aligned movement then for the first session was Zimbabwe. So during the Cold War years, the world was split into 2 main blocks: the Western Free Blocks, the Communist Eastern Bloc, but then there was also another grouping. It was called the non-aligned movement. It was not a proxy of the Western Bloc or a proxy of the Eastern Bloc. It was its own movement, its own bloc. It's called non-aligned movement. It also participated in the Paris Peace Agreement, in the Paris Conference, and signed the agreement. During the first session in 1989, Zimbabwe was present. In the second session, when the agreement was signed in 1991, it was Yugoslavia. As you know, the world doesn't have a Yugoslavia anymore. Yugoslavia balkanized, broke up into other countries: Montenegro, Serbia, Croatia. But then in 1991, Yugoslavia was present at the signing and signed the Paris Peace Agreement. We move on. So this is what is in the first document of the Paris Agreement. Number 4, at the first session of the conference, Cambodia was represented by 4 Cambodian parties. This is 1989, the first session. The Supreme National Council of Cambodia, under the leadership of the president, His Royal Highness Prince Norodom Sihanouk, represented Cambodia in the second session in the conference. 1989, there were 4 factions who represented themselves in the conference. But for the second session, they came together under the headship of Prince Norodom Sihanouk in this transitional body called the Supreme National Council. It was only for that time period, the Supreme National Council, SNC, as a bridge before things could be firmed up. So here are, the second person to the left is Hun Sen, representing the Vietnamese military power in Cambodia. He was propped up as first as the foreign minister, and then foreign minister and prime minister by the Vietnamese military power in Cambodia, and continues to be in leadership to this day. The middle is Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who has the most weight, the gravitas to be able to call everyone together. To his left is Ieng Moli, representing Son San faction, which formed the Buddhist Liberal Democratic Party. And the very right is Khieu Samphan, whom I met on several occasions, on many occasions. First, before he was arrested at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and then during the many sessions at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. So those are the 4 factions. Hun Sen representing the Vietnamese military power. King Norodom Sihanouk, his son, was the royalist Phun Sampek party. Ieng Moli was Son San's representative, and Khieu Samphan was the head of the Khmer Rouge. He was the head of state of the Khmer Rouge. So those are the 4 Cambodian factions. But then when it was signed under one umbrella, the Supreme National Council, SNC, a transitional body under the leadership of then Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Next. The UN has 6 major organs, as you know. All 6 have been active in Cambodia. But with regards to the Paris Agreement, there are 3 of the 6 main organs of the United Nations that are active from day one, from the time Vietnam invaded Cambodia to the time of the UN organized elections. And of course, then it continues to be active in Cambodia and other forms, for example, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights. But the 3 main organs that were active, politically active, diplomatically active from day one, using its power and influence, and the fact that it's part of an umbrella organization, including most of the countries of the world. It was quite something. So the Paris Peace Accord is the final product of over a decade long of diplomatic and political wrangling in the United Nations, in particular in these 3 organs. They actively, continually engaged on the Cambodian situation, which was one of, if not the prominent concern that was on table at the United Nations during the decade of the 1980s, culminating in the Paris Peace Agreement. So let's look at these organs. It's the UN General Assembly, UNGA. Now it has the United Nations General Assembly has 193 member states. In international law, countries are known as states. So 193 countries known as member states. I don't know how many member states in 1991. So that's the UN General Assembly. We every September we tend to see leaders traveling to New York for the UN for the UNGA summit. The second organ that was active from the very beginning, and all its permanent members signed the agreement and engaged in the conference and throughout that decade, is the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council has 5 permanent members and 10 rotating members. And these 5 members have been members since the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco, California in 1945, when they were the superpowers and they could insert themselves into this very powerful organ of the United Nations with veto power. So the 5 permanent members have veto power, thus their strength. They are the United States, China, France, the United Kingdom, and then the Soviet Union, which has been replaced by Russia. And then the middle, of course, is the UN Secretariat, symbolized by one individual, the UN Secretary General. Then it was Javier Perez de Cuellar, a senior diplomat from Peru. He just passed away last year in 2020 at the ripe age of 100 years old. So anyway, he was the UN Secretary General throughout the decade of the 1980s, and thus knew the Cambodia conflict really well from day one. Okay, so those are the 3 of the 6 major organs of the United Nations relevant for the Paris Peace Conference and Paris Peace Agreement. Cambodia also knows one other organ that is relevant for Cambodia, but not on this topic of the Paris Agreement, and that's the International Court of Justice. Yes, the ICJ is one of the 6 major organs of the United Nations, and it has its quarter in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And Cambodia knows ICJ because of the Brehvihir case between the temple in Brehvihir, the tension between Thailand and Cambodia, and ICJ has confirmed that Brehvihir belongs to Cambodia. Okay, we move on. Some of the images of the principal individuals involved in the Paris Conference and the agreement. We'll look at their names in a bit. Let me take a sip of coffee. In the middle, I'm going to pull the screen closer. So in the middle, we have the UN Secretary General in the first image at the very top, at the left-hand top corner, is the UN Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar. To his left, also in the middle, is Roland Dumas, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for France. He was one of 2 co-presidents with Indonesia, and they're looking and speaking with Prince Norodom Sihanouk. So that's the first and the second top picture. The bottom picture, the larger one, is of the four Cambodian factions, the four Cambodian parties, with Roland Dumar, the French foreign minister. So there's Khieu Samphan, the head of state of the Khmer Rouge, Son San of the resistance along the border, Prince Norodom Sihanouk in the middle, and to his left is Roland Dumar, and to the very right is a very young Hun Sen, representing the Vietnamese military power in Cambodia. The middle is again Roland Dumar with Prince Sihanouk and Hun Sen. So those are the images. We move on next. Okay, so we're still looking at the language of the first part of the agreement, or the first document, entitled the Final Act of the Paris Conference. So number 5, the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Javier Perez de Cuellar, and his special representative, Mr. Rafidin Ahmed, also participated in the conference. Just to give you a sense of the significance and the gravitas of the whole summit, of this top summit. Number 9, the first document is numbered 1, 2, 3. It's not an article, article 1 or 2. No. It's just because it's a description. Number 9, at the inaugural portion of the final meeting of the Paris Conference on 23 October 1991, the conference was addressed by Mr. François Mitterrand, President of the French Republic, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, President of the Supreme National Council of Cambodia, a transitional body created to include the 4 Cambodian factions, and Javier Perez de Cuellar, Secretary General of the United Nations. Again, the dignitaries, the fact that these dignitaries are named and their positions reflect the importance and the significance of this agreement that is of global international nature, involving the superpowers in the Western sphere and in the region. And not only the superpowers in terms of countries, but the individuals were themselves dignitaries known by the world. Okay, so we continue. Next slide. So this is still the language of the first document, but I took it from the Khmer version, from my version. Number 13, the states participating in the conference request the International Committee of the Red Cross to facilitate, in accordance with its principles, the release of prisoners of war and civilian internees. They express their readiness to assist the ICRC in this task. I'm putting this point here. I'm showing this excerpt from the first document because it's a theme that is repeated often in the 4 documents, in the 4 portions, 4 parts of the Paris Agreement. And the first picture is of Pain Savan. Pain Savan was the first individual propped up by Vietnam to be prime minister during its occupation, immediately after it invaded. But then he refused to implement Vietnamization policies as ordered by Le Docteur. So he was immediately detained and whizzed away to Hanoi, to solitary confinement in Hanoi. And save for the Paris Agreement, he would still be languishing in a prison in Hanoi. But this agreement demands for the release of all political prisoners. The most famous one is Pain Savan, and civilian internees. The second picture is a recent picture of prisoners of conscience, young activists who are fighting to save the environment, the forests, the preserve parks in Cambodia, and they have been detained. Some of them have been released in recent days because of the changing wind of politics. But so it's a living issue. This is a living document. Next. Just to recap what we just have seen. Remember, I said there are two periods where the Paris Agreement is addressing. The period that is known to everyone, and everyone believes that the Paris Peace Agreement is solely addressing this period, is the Khmer Rouge years. 3 years, 8 months, 20 days, April 1979, 5, January 1979. Everyone knows this. All the resources address this period. What is not known, and is really the main impetus for the Paris Peace Agreement, as you have seen from the titles of the 4 documents and some of the languages of the first document, what people do not know, almost everyone do not know, that is to address first and foremost the immediate emergency situation of the Vietnamese military occupation of Cambodia, which had been debated and fought in the United Nations from the time of its occupation, and resulted in the Paris Conference because the political situation allowed for it, mainly the thawing of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was funding Vietnamese military occupation of Cambodia, which allowed for the first session to occur, and then 2 years later, the second session of 1991. So remember that this is the reason, the impetus. I mean, the two main eras are the Khmer Rouge, which everyone knows about, but what has been wrongly interpreted and wrongly, grossly, very costly to Cambodia and Cambodians have been the misunderstanding that it's solely the Khmer Rouge and no knowledge of the almost effectively 14 years of military occupation by Vietnam of Cambodia, which is the reason for the Paris Peace Agreement. First and foremost, of course, it also on human rights, on democracy, and other subtopics addresses the Khmer Rouge years. Okay. Oh, and stay on this slide a minute. The Paris Peace Agreement and the content, mainly UNTAC, in terms of cost, in terms of cash, in terms of what it cost the world in funding, 2.4 billion, 9 zeros, $2,400,000,000 for it took to fund the operations of UNTAC in Cambodia. Unprecedented. So the Paris Peace Accord is unprecedented in who and which country got involved, which countries got involved, and the individuals, global, well-known names, dignitaries in the international sphere who were involved. And it cost the international community $2.4 billion, which in today's currency is $5 billion. But I'm certain it's more than that because it was really expensive. Money was really expensive in 1991. There are so many billionaires now. To be a millionaire was really a big deal in 1991. Now everyone's a millionaire. to be a billionaire, and now a trillionaire is a big deal. So it may be more than 5 billion, but that's the equivalence that Google gave me when I punched in 2.4 billion for of 1991 to now. Okay, we go on. This time period I have documented in terms of gleaning hard to access written articles, abstracts, chapters of books, very, very few information, but I have gleaned enough to give you a sense of what this dark period looks like. And you can find, you can, and actually read the documents, the primary sources yourself from my Facebook. There's no paywall. Their primary sources, and they're in English. I've given screenshots of and made notes, but you can see a little bit of my interpretation, but you can actually see the original text itself. And so it's in my website. You go to thearyseng.com, you can't miss it. It's always a page there on every page. And go to the published articles in English regarding Vietnamization. There are 7 parts, and these are the 7 parts. I think I'm going to take time to read them. The first is Cambodia from 1979 to 1984. This is, I put it in chronological order because this is not known information. Cambodians themselves know about Vietnamization, but they know from personal experience. They don't know because they have read, because there are no information in the Khmer language, as you can imagine. And the information, the written information in English are very difficult to access, and everyone is more interested in speaking about recent events and the Khmer Rouge era than these unknown time and this unknown time era. So it's very important that you read these documents, these published articles by established world-renowned writers like Elizabeth Becker, Steve Heder, Philip Short, Francois Panchaud, Father Panchaud. It's very important that you read them and help to rebalance the very disproportionate narrative that is very, very costly to Cambodia and to Cambodians. All of us have been complicit in perpetuating a narrative about the Khmer Rouge that has dominated all other conversations, in particular these 14 years of military occupation where mass crimes, including genocides, multiple genocides, legal genocides occurred. Because we have been complicit in perpetuating the wrong narrative or disproportionate narrative, we need to also help to recalibrate the narrative to a more balanced view of Cambodian recent history. They're very difficult to access documents, but you can find them. I have prepared them in a systematic way, chronologically, with some of my input and learning into the primary sources that I have posted as screenshots, or as basically screenshots of the chapters, abstracts, articles I've read and have put together in this format. So let me finish reading the 4 parts. The first is Cambodia under occupation from 1979 to 1984. The second is Cambodia under occupation from 1985 to 1991. I go year by year from the very limited published articles in English I managed to glean from cyberspace, from the books I've had. The third is Cambodia from 1991 to 1999, that whole decade, year by year. For the fourth part is Cambodia and from 2000 to the present. And here I address the very politicized genocide verdict at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. And then the fifth is I look and by drawing from articles, so you can actually read the articles, the published articles yourselves on Vietnamization based on demographic Vietnamization, the articles addressing that, military Vietnamization, the articles addressing that, and then Vietnamization along the borders. We share along borders. A long border with Vietnam, with many provinces. So Vietnamization in Ratanakiri, Vietnamization in Svay Rieng, and I have so much more materials that I have not included because it's really time consuming, as you can see, once you go into it. The sixth part is Vietnamization, China response. Now we have China. Vietnam is still present in Cambodia. It's always been the fifth column. It's very effective in keeping itself behind the scenes. But China makes no qualm about being the present in Cambodia. So now we have Vietnam still behind the scene, even though it's more obvious now. But China is very, very much alive and present in Cambodia. So six is China responds to Vietnam. China responds to the U.S. and the free world. China responds to ASEAN. So with one Cambodia stone, China gets three birds: Vietnam, the Western world, and ASEAN. And then the seventh part is Vietnamization, third party spokesperson. Ben Kiernan and the Yale Genocide Program is very, very problematic for Cambodia, Cambodians, in particular, Cambodians who are fighting for democracy. Ben Kiernan is a friend of this autocratic regime. His interpretation of the Khmer Rouge is really problematic. This is coming from Steve Heder, who is the premier Khmer Rouge expert. Steve Heder, anything you read by Steve Heder, anything you read by Elizabeth Becker, you can trust. Now, there are many writers on Cambodia, but not all of them are friends of Cambodia or Cambodian Democrats. Some and there are many, and still not as that we have more friends than this autocratic regime, but they are friends of this autocratic regime. Ben Kiernan, Helen Jarvis, they are friends of Hun Sen and the autocratic regime. So I address that issue by allowing you to read the articles by established writers themselves and yourselves. Okay, so you can find them at my website. It's very important that you know this time period because it's just literally dark, unknown to Cambodia, even though we know about Vietnamization through experience, but it's not known to the world who is and the international community and the individuals who are the with influence, and they're perpetuating a narrative that is very costly and very grossly wrong on Cambodia, very costly to Cambodians and to Cambodia. Okay, please check out this page and these 7 parts, because again, this time period is the reason, is the impetus, first and foremost, for the Paris Peace Accord, which involved the superpowers, the regional powers, the powers of the world. We move on. So here are 3 documents which used to be classified, but now has been declassified by the CIA, by the Defense Department, coming out of the United States on the Vietnamese military occupation of Cambodia. Very telling. very telling. So these are three documents I've been able to um, glean from the internet. You can read the whole report um, about the Vietnamese military occupation done by the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Department of the United States. If we move on. Just to give you a taste of what that dark, long period of 14 years were like, that I have published on my website in the southern parts. So here are some of the articles I've gleaned and excerpts from those articles. Francois Ponchot, a French, this is, okay, Francois Ponchot, a French Jesuit who had diligently chronicled the destructiveness of the Khmer Rouge in his book Cambodia, Year Zero, maintained that the Vietnamese were conducting a new, subtle genocide against the Cambodian people. This was an excerpt from an article written by William Shawcross, an established, well-respected journalist who wrote the book Sideshow, focusing on the carpet bombings of the United States on Cambodia in the Washington Post in 1980. So this is an excerpt from that article that he wrote in 1980 in the Washington Post. According to the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, the Vietnamese invasion and food embargo caused 700,000 deaths in Cambodia in 1979. This is Stephen Morris, an expert who used to teach at the Johns Hopkins University, wrote for the Harvard International Review, published in 1981. I'm going to read fast and I have to speak faster because I'm conscious of time now. At present, 200,000 Vietnamese soldiers occupy Cambodia, behind them following a policy dictated by Hanoi. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians now are beginning to establish themselves in the country. In history, there are few more obvious examples of a final solution devised to blot out a national and ethnic identity. The Cambodians are now being absorbed. This is an excerpt by James Webb, published in the Washington Post in 1983. 200,000 Vietnamese soldiers. Vietnam then had the third largest military in the world. And hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians following behind. This is during the invasion, the first year now. And the first year, the whole year, January to December 1979, 700,000 Cambodians who just barely survived from the Khmer Rouge, now cowering under another communist regime, but now a foreign hostile power. Almost 1 million died under the first year of Vietnamese military occupation. No one knows. It is your duty and your responsibility, our duty and our responsibility, who have unwittingly, unintentionally, some intentionally, perpetuated this gross narrative of racism against Cambodians as a cover for mass crimes. We need to help to correct the narrative by understanding, you need to read these articles. And they're difficult to find, but now you have no excuse because I have compiled them in an orderly, systematic way for you to read. without cost. Okay, we move on. Some more, a few more excerpts, and then we continue with the language of the Paris Accord. Work on what the Cambodians call the K5 project was essentially slave labor, and conditions in the malaria-infested and heavily mined border regions were appalling and dangerous. A minimum of 50,000 volunteers were estimated to have succumbed to yellow fever alone by the end of 1986, prompted by one Western observer to refer to the campaign as the new genocide. This is from the book Bamboo Wall, a translation that was written by Dr. Esmeralda. I forgot her last name, Luciali. She was a doctor with Doctors Without Border, and she was inside the country in the 1980s. It's a lot more than that. It's a lot more than that. Now I'll make a point in a little bit. We'll continue reading first. The requisitioning of civilians started in September 1984. It started way more because Pain Savan knows about this. The Cambodians often refer to the departure of the clearing duty as a new April 17. 17 April 1975 marks the entry of the Khmer Rouge in Phnom Penh. The K5 plan, described by some people as a new genocide, made tens of thousands, possibly thousands of thousands, over 1 million of victims. See Un Nouveau Génocide, Philippe Paquet in La Libre Belgique, of an article that was written in May 1986 in French. During our outings in the provinces, it was rarer and rarer to see men tilling the fields, and most of the time, women planted bedded plants or harvested on their own. This is Dr. Esmeralda Luciali, the author of The Bamboo Wall, Le Mur de Bambou. At the end of the Cambodia's war, there were entire villages which had no men. And I saw this. I was at a church service when this Christian pastor was saying this, and he had a slideshow. I managed to capture this slide where he had this written. And this Christian pastor has lived here since 1990. So this is what he witnessed in 1990 onward. So we're not talking about 1979. We're talking about after 14 years of Vietnamese military occupation, there were entire villages without men that he saw. Remember, the Khmer Rouge committed auto-genocide against its own people, and it mattered not whether they were men or women. Male or female, the Khmer Rouge were indiscriminate. But when the Vietnamese were targeting men, this is legal genocide because it is to erase, to decimate a race, a people, which neatly fits the legal conditions of the legal definition of genocide. Okay, we move on. Oh, one or two more yet. For 10 years, the Vietnamese tried to apply to Cambodia a policy of ethnocide, the destruction of a culture within those who carry it, insidiously carried out, particularly in the beginning in the educational domain. This is from an excerpt from a book by Madame let me read. Her name is Marie Alexandrine Matang, and the book that she wrote in French that has been so well translated into English that it reads like it's the original language. The title in English is, excuse me. The title in English of the book is Cambodia, a Shattered Society. And this excerpt is gleaned from chapter 8 that is entitled The Vietnamese Occupation and the Resistance. It's in French. The original, it was originally written in French, so well translated in English and published by the California Press. It's so good. It's very, very expensive to buy of the very few copies out there because it's no longer in print. Marie Alexandrine Martin is an expert of Cambodia of the 1960s. She was, I believe, well, she had been in Cambodia doing research, ethnology, I can't, on Cambodia. But anyway, she's an established figure on Cambodia. And the book that she has written on Cambodia is called Cambodia, a Shattered Society. And this is an excerpt from a chapter 8. Okay, we move on. So again, a recap. Why you do not know about this time period. Because one, it's been Vietnam has effectively been successful in drawing everyone's attention to focus on the Khmer Rouge years, which accords with what we want, with our shock and horror anyway. But it was effective in charging us with racism solely on the word Yuan. And the other reason is because all the resources in terms of books, in terms of films, in terms of artwork, in terms of museums, in terms of the Yale Genocide program, in terms of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, all the resources in most of the languages, in particular English, are on the Khmer Rouge years and none, literally none on the 14 years of the Vietnamese military occupation. And we, the Cambodian Americans, the Cambodian Australians, we, the survivors of the Khmer Rouge, who hardly lived under the military occupation because we were given life in a third country. We only remember the Khmer Rouge years. We speak about the Khmer Rouge years, so it helped perpetuate the narrative and continue to have the Khmer Rouge conversation dominate all other conversation, in particular the Vietnamese military occupation. And the foreign writers are interested in writing solely on the Khmer Rouge years, and we are stopped from speaking about the Vietnamese military occupation because of the charge of racism, which effectively cut off all conversation, and they are not open to hear anything except the Khmer Rouge. There's emotionally, psychologically, everyone is attuned to the Khmer Rouge, and Vietnam effectively uses that psychology and trend to help us in that direction by having the Khmer Rouge dominate all other conversations. And of course, added to it all, the U.S. war fatigue. The U.S. didn't want anything to do with Southeast Asia anymore. Thus, overnight, there were no major newspapers covering Southeast Asia after the U.S. left. And so Cambodia lived under the Vietnamese military occupation with almost zero media scrutiny. And so this is why we still don't have resources written about that era. One, we don't know enough about that era for the researchers to write about. Two, the survivors are within the country and they are not free to talk about it. So many reasons, but these are the main ones. We move on. Okay, so we established that the impetus, the first and foremost impetus for the Paris Peace Accord is the Vietnamese military occupation. Of course, it addresses the human rights issues and the Cambodia conflict during the Khmer Rouge years, human rights, democracy issues of both eras. but the immediate response was toward the military occupation of Cambodia. And we said that there are four documents, four parts that form the Paris Peace Agreement. The first we have looked at. Now we're going to look at the second and the third and their languages. They are the core, the heart, the substance of what is known as the Paris Peace Agreement. So we're going to, and the second one is the most lengthy, and it has a table of contents. So it gives us a sense of what are under the main title, what are the other important focus that is important. Okay, so let's pull the screen, zoom out a little bit to look at the second portion, the second part of the Paris Peace Agreement has the title, Agreement on a Comprehensive Political Settlement of the Cambodia Conflict. This is the actual title of the second document, or the second part of the Paris Agreement. Okay, we move on. So we're going to look a little bit at some of the languages, the actual language of this second document, which is the part, the core of the Paris Agreement. So it starts with the countries. We already have seen those countries already. And then it says, in the presence of the Secretary General of the United Nations, in the presence, meaning that he's a witness. The Secretary General of the United Nations is a witness to all of this. In order to maintain, preserve, and defend the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and inviolability, neutrality, and national unity of Cambodia. Again, a theme that is repeated often in the main title of the core of a core document, document 3, and now repeated again in the preamble of the second document, desiring to restore and maintain peace in Cambodia, to promote national reconciliation, and to ensure the exercise of the right to self-determination of the Cambodian people through free and fair elections. This is a preamble now, so it's a comma. So before we go to the heart of the matter, convinced that only a comprehensive political settlement to the Cambodia conflict will be just and durable, and will contribute to a regional and international peace and security. So this is not just about Cambodia and Cambodians. The concern is for international and regional peace, international and regional security. We move on. We continue with the language of the second document, the longest one, noting the statements made at the conclusion of the meetings held in Jakarta in 1990, in Paris in December 19, also in December, the first is September 1990, in Paris in December 1990, in Pattaya in June 1991, in Beijing in July 1991, in Pattaya again, Thailand in August 1991, and also the meetings held in Jakarta again in June 1991, and in New York in September 1991. Wow, people were jet setting. So the 2.4 billion doesn't include all the five-star hotels of the hundreds who are joining these meetings in these countries crisscrossing the world. Welcoming United Nations Security Council, one of the 6 main organs of the UN system, resolution decision 717 of 1991 on Cambodia, recognizing that Cambodia's tragic recent history requires special measures to assure protection of human rights and the non-return to the policies and practices of the past. This recent includes both the Khmer Rouge and even more recently and more immediately the decade-long military occupation of Cambodia by Vietnam. So recent history has been interpreted solely to mean the Khmer Rouge, but now you know better that it's also addressing the decade plus long military occupation by Vietnam. We move on. So here's the table of contents to give you a sense, a flavor of the focus, the significance of what they're thinking, of what this agreement is all about. So this is the second document now, the second part of the Paris Agreement, and we're going to look at the table of contents. And these are the titles in the table of contents. Part 1, arrangements during the transitional period. So there's the transitional period, there's the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, there's the Supreme National Council, there's the withdrawal of foreign forces, and here foreign forces is the Vietnam military and its verification. Of course, there was verification, but the UN didn't go out to Ratanakiri, to Mandolkiri, to the jungle to verify whether Vietnam pulled out its military. And we know in hindsight that the Vietnamese military basically just changed outfits from military uniforms to civilian clothes. Ceasefire and cessation of outside military assistance. So this is part 1 under the transitional period. Note that it is a transitional period, and under the transitional period is UNTAC and SNC. UNTAC and SNC are in part 1 under the transitional period. The agreement itself prepared for these two bodies, the United Nations Transitional Authority, even it has the word transitional in its name, and the Supreme National Council as transitional bodies. So it's in the first part under arrangement during the transitional period. They're gone now. Not because it's transitional. It's only to serve as a bridge, as an emergency bridge for that time period. From autocracy, communist to democracy. That was the idea, that they needed these two bodies to establish for that time period to get moving. Anyway, we move on. The second part is about the elections that occurred in May 1993. This was signed in October 1991, 2 years before the elections. The third part is on human rights. The fourth part is on international guarantees. The fifth part is refugees and displaced persons. Again, we in 2021 are in the same situation with these issues. This is a living treaty, a living document that is very relevant to present day Cambodia. Okay, we move on with the table of contents of the second part of the agreement. Next. So part 6, the release of prisoners of war and civilian internees. Again, a repeated theme. Part 7, principles for a new constitution for Cambodia. Once the elections occurred in May 1993, there's a constituent assembly to be able to create a constitution. And what are the principles that must be included, that are fundamental to a democracy? Free, fair elections, meaning multi-party elections and competition, not one party. Having genuine opposition leaders inside, having press, free press, having active civil society. So this document is very relevant to our time. Part 8, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Part 9, the final provisions. And then in this second document, there are annexes. And of course, an annex describes in more details these themes that have been mentioned in the body of the agreement in the core document. And now they're going to, Annex 1 is going to detail further the mandate of UNTAC, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia. Annex 2 will detail some more the withdrawal, ceasefire, and related measures. Annex 3 will provide further information about the conduct of elections, the registration process, for example. Annex 4 will give more details on the repatriation of Cambodian refugees and displaced persons. And Annex 5 will give more information and details about the principles for a new constitution of Cambodia. So this is the table of contents for the second document, the longest document, the core of the Paris Peace Agreement. We move on. And as you know, the May 1993 elections, which was organized by the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, UNTAC, was a major success. 90% of the Cambodians turned out to vote, and Hun Sen lost. Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party lost. It received only 38% of the votes. The people overwhelmingly voted for democracy, and Fun Simpec won. But unfortunately, the leadership of Fun Simpec was very weak, and over the years allowed Hun Sen to wiggle himself back into power. Really, really a tragedy for Cambodia and Cambodians to this day. So let's look at the images. The euphoria of the elections. When people felt that it was free and fair, they turned out en masse. But there was still violence, but nonetheless, Cambodians queue for hours to exercise this fundamental right to vote in a free and fair elections. The bottom images are more recent images from 2013, when we had the highest hope of pushing out this autocratic regime and ushering in democracy. But then, as you know, Vang Sring massacre occurred in January 2014 and ended, and since then has been a downhill fast slide into autocracy. Next. Okay, so now we're going to look at the third document. The third document is another core, the heart. Document 2, Document 3 are the heart, the substance of the Paris Peace Agreement, and it uses articles, right? Document 1 and Document 4 are descriptions, so it's point 1, point 2, but Document 2 and Document 3, and we're going to look briefly at some of the points listed in there. They have the word agreement in their title. And 2, they use is Article 1, Article 2. Parties are promised to do this, and the law can bind them. So that's why they're the heart, the core of the Paris Agreement. So the title of Document 3, or the third portion of the Paris Peace Agreement, is entitled Agreement Concerning the Sovereignty, Independence, Territorial integrity and inviolability, neutrality, and national unity of Cambodia. This is the title. It's lengthy. It's like a paragraph long, but you can see the significance that it mentions these words: sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity. We're not talking about the Khmer Rouge years, We're talking about the military occupation. Vietnamese forces, third most powerful in the world then, exuberant from having won the war against the superpower, the United States, but completely depleted of resources. And now it's occupying Cambodia, it's raping Cambodia, it's plundering Cambodia, stripping it of its natural resources in the lakes, in the sea, in the mountains, in the forests, in the rivers. So this is the military occupation. This is the third document. Let's look briefly at what it says. It's not long. Next slide. Okay, so again, it mentions the countries as the parties. In this document, it's very clear that the countries mentioned prior to this sentence in the presence of the Secretary General, it lists all the countries, the 19 countries, as parties, not as witnesses, not as observers, as parties legally binding in this Paris Peace Agreement. And we're going to see the language just a bit. But prior to this first statement in the presence of the Secretary General, we have the listing of the 19 countries again: France, the United States, Britain, Japan, Australia, all the 5 major permanent members with veto power of the UN Secretary and UN Security Council, the 5 founding members of ASEAN, Japan, Australia, Canada. They're parties to this agreement. In the presence of the Secretary General of the United Nations, he is the witness. The other countries are parties. In the presence of the Secretary General, who is witness, convinced that a comprehensive political settlement for Cambodia is essential for the long-term objective of maintaining peace and security in Southeast Asia. Again, the theme, the significance, the underscoring of peace and security for the region, for internationally. In the second document, it said regionally, internationally. Here, it mentions specifically Southeast Asia because the Vietnamese military occupation of Cambodia, the invasion by Vietnam of Cambodia, poses a threat to the regional countries. And the founding, in particular, Thailand, because Thailand did not want Vietnam, should it occupy and subsume and turn Cambodia into its province on its border. So Thailand was pushing back and thus gave refuge to some of the Khmer Rouge and, of course, the refugees or then displaced persons. Singapore, a tiny emerging power on the rise to becoming a major economic powerhouse, did not want a situation in international law, in the in international politics, to have a president or have a habit where large countries can easily invade another country that is smaller. Singapore, of course, was thinking of its own petite physical size. I mean, it's a city state sandwiched in by Malaysia, by Indonesia. So it was thinking about its own personal interests. Of course, I've read a lot on this to confirm this, and I had a conversation with professor, a dignitary in Singapore. She was a professor for many years, but during the 1980s, she was at the United Nations. And then I met her when she was ambassador to the United States through Ambassador Eng Rolong, a friend of mine. And then Stephen Solars, the former, who has passed away, representative from New York, very powerful representative from New York, with ancestors who survived the Holocaust. I mean, he was aghast at what happened in Cambodia and was very active in about the Cambodia situation. So I met him, and then he invited me and invited Professor or then Ambassador. I forgot her name. Now let me, can you pull up the screen a little bit bigger so I can read her name so I get it right? Jan Heng Chi. She was ambassador to his home for Thanksgiving dinner because Professor Chan Heng Chi, ambassador then at that time, didn't have a family. I didn't have a family. Of course, Thanksgiving is a family holiday. So he invited us, and he had asked that Ambassador Chan Heng Chi if she could give me a ride to his house in, I think, in Potomac or one of the wealthy suburbs of Washington, D.C. Anyway, so I had a little bit of conversation with Ambassador Chan Heng Chi, a very respected professor, diplomat in Singapore. So the concern is a national interest on the part of Singapore, that it did not want the international did not want international politics to be based on a rule that is emerging, where a large country can invade a small country, because it was very conscious of its size that is sandwiched in by two massive powers, Malaysia and Indonesia. Okay, so let's continue reading the wording, some of the excerpts from document 3 of the agreement. Recalling the obligations under the Charter of the United Nations and other rules of international law, considering that full observance of the principles of non-interference and non-intervention in the internal and external affairs of states. Again, it's addressing the Vietnamese military occupation. This is not addressing the Khmer Rouge years, really. Reaffirming the inalienable right of states freely to determine their own political, economic, and cultural and social systems in accordance with the will of their own peoples, without outside interference, subversion, coercion, or threat in any form whatsoever. Again, addressing the occupation years. Desiring to promote respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. Again, just for you to see the word, and hopefully you will actually read the Paris Peace Agreement itself, go to USIP, United States Institute for Peace. Of course, you can go to the website of the United Nations, but the font there is very difficult to read. The USIP website has a version that is easier to read. We continue. Okay, so Article 1 of this third document's agreement concerning the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, etc. Article 1 addresses the obligations of Cambodia toward respecting the sovereignty of other nations. Article 2, this is Article 2 now. The other parties, meaning the other 18 signatories, France, Vietnam, China, Indonesia, Thailand, etc., the other parties to this agreement hereby solemnly undertake to recognize and to respect in every way the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and inviolability, neutrality, and national unity of Cambodia. The other parties are the 18 other signatories besides Cambodia. Cambodia is in Article 1. Article 2 addresses the other parties, the other 18 signatories to this Paris Peace Agreement. They're not observers, they're not witnesses, they are parties with legal obligations who have promises to respect, to recognize the sovereignty, independence. Then it was Vietnam mainly, China also. Now it's both Vietnam and China that this living document addresses and can address. And this is why Cambodians are always constantly talking about the Paris Peace Agreement because of this. This is a living document. This is a living article. We continue. Okay, Article 3. Let's just move on and talks about the rights and freedoms. Please read the document. It's not long. Article 2 and Article 3 are the core, and then I think there are only about three or four of 5 articles total. So we move on. And then the last document is only 2 pages in English, and it's a declaration. And it has point 1, point 2, point 3. It doesn't have Article 1, Article 2, because there's nothing to promise and there's nothing that's legally binding. A declaration on the rehabilitation and reconstruction of Cambodia. So states are encouraged to contribute. So there's no legally binding where they have to pay $1 million to the reconstruction in Cambodia. So that's the difference between document 2 and document 3, the core of the Paris Peace Agreement, which have agreement in their titles and are legally binding because the parties agree promises, and then they're legally bound. They are legally binding language. And they use articles, Article 1, Article 2. But here in Document 1, the final act, and here in Document 4, the declaration, their suggestions, their requests for contribution. The first one is a description of what went on that last day. So this is the difference between, of the 4 parts, the 2 middle ones are the heart, the legally binding part of the agreement. The first and the second, the first is the description. The second is a request for contribution. And of course, in the description, it gives you a sense of the gravitas of the conference and the scope and magnitude of the Paris Peace Agreement. We move on to the next slide. We're almost done. 2 more minutes, everyone, hang on. Okay, we're not going to read this whole page, this screenshot, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that in the Declaration on Rehabilitation and Reconstruction, it's to involve the whole United Nations system. It's that big. The scope was unprecedented. In 1991, the Paris Peace Agreement and the contents and what it promised to do via UNTAC and the amount that it raised, that it expended, 2.4 billion, was unprecedented in UN history at that time. And the fact that the United Nations created a transitional authority as an emergency bridge to pull Cambodia from out of occupation, out of communism, toward democracy was unprecedented as well. So now the rehabilitation is to involve the whole United Nations system. And as you know, the United Nations is not an organization, it's a system. Think of it as an umbrella with 6 major organs, 3 you've heard already, and then the International Court of Justice, ECOSOC, and then one other one I forgot. And then, of course, all the other networks like UNDP is a network of many, many organizations and institutions. And then the specialized agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, the ADB, and of course, all other smaller, UNESCO, UNICEF. My goodness, the whole United Nations system. Think of it as an umbrella, okay? And it did. We saw everything under the sun from the United Nations and its related agencies and institutions working in Cambodia. We still have a residue to that day. Thus, it was poor, but when I came back to Cambodia and worked in 1995, it was extremely poor still. It was the image that I had remembered from when I left in 1979, despite the 14, or not 14, 16 years of occupation since the Khmer Rouge. So the occupation further destroyed Cambodia. That is not known. But anyway, when I came back, it was extremely poor, but it was hopeful because Cambodians just emerged out of these elections that they voted with freely, and Fun Simpek was in power. Again, we know what happened since then. But anyway, I want to draw your attention to the magnitude, the scope of the rehabilitation and the reconstruction, and of the agreement and the operation in general, the mandate in general of that, and then also to this other point that is important. It will be necessary. I'll just read that point. No effective program of national reconstruction can be initiated without detailed assessments of Cambodia's human, natural, and other economic assets. It would be necessary for a census to be conducted, developmental priorities identified, and the availability of resources, internal and external, determined. This was signed in October 1991. Requesting that a census be taken to understand the resources, human, economic resources of the country in order to reconstruct and rehabilitate Cambodia. The census that I found, the first census that I found, and I hope someone can prove me wrong or can tell me otherwise, was in 1998. I believe August 1998, at least, or 7 years later. 7 years later from the time that this was called for. With all the resources there, with all the funding there, but it didn't take place until 1998. And what happened in 1997? There was a coup where Vietnam called Hun Sen to Vietnam before the coup and came back with more troops. The coup in 1997 established Hun Sen as the sole power again in Cambodia. Fun Simpek was no longer in the picture. Now they feel confident, this regime feel confident after the coup to conduct a census. The timing is very important. So someone please tell me that I'm wrong, that the first census was not in 1998, that it occurred immediately after the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement. I would like to know. I can only find from my search on the internet the first census being in 1998. Let's go to the next slide on this point. Here is why it is important. So here's what I found. General Population Census of Cambodia of 1998. I did not find one earlier than this. But here's what important. Two excerpts from two established writers in English. The screenshot, Habits of War, a chapter from the book When the War Was Over by Elizabeth Becker. Read, the demise of the new economic zones also killed an even more ambitious plan. Hanoi had hoped that the Southerners, Cambodia, could pioneer the frontier areas near the Cambodian border and make room for Northerners to move south. Hanoi created an elaborate blueprint for moving 10 million people from the more densely populated north to the south by the year 2000. The mentality of the Red River Vietnamese had not changed. They wanted to push further south and west, which is Cambodia, which they did finally, not through new economic zones, but by invading and occupying Cambodia 2 years later. This blueprint was in 1976. 2 years later, 1978, the invasion of Cambodia by Vietnam. And then, of course, we've read this already, but it's important to address the census matter, the Vietnamese demographic Vietnamization. At present, 200,000 Vietnamese soldiers occupy Cambodia. Behind them, following a policy dictated by Hanoi, the blueprint for 10 million Vietnamese to occupy the South and West Cambodia. Following a policy dictated by Hanoi, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese are beginning to establish themselves in the country. In history, there are few more obvious examples of a final solution devised to blot out a national and ethnic identity. The Cambodians are now being absorbed. The Washington Post, 1983. And as you know, now there are images of Vietnamese occupying the whole of the Tonle Sap, the Mekong River, blocking the waterway, polluting the Mekong, polluting the Tonle Sap, creating an ecological disaster for Cambodia and Cambodians and the livelihood of the hundreds of thousands and millions of lives depending on the natural resources of the Tonle Sap. And so that's that. And then, of course, the open border from Vietnam into Cambodia, but not vice versa. Still a problem to this day, but now in addition, the strong presence of the Chinese. Okay, so we move on. A reminder, let's pull it up, that the Paris Peace, this is the conclusion now, the Paris Peace Agreement addresses two periods. Everyone knows the Khmer Rouge era. Yes, it addresses the Khmer Rouge era. But first and foremost, the first impetus, the first reason for the Paris Peace Agreement is to address the Vietnamese military occupation of Cambodia, an era of effectively 14 years with continued presence to this day that are not known. And Cambodians, we know from personal experience, but we cannot talk about it because until recently, until I started posting these articles, we could not speak about it because of the false charge of racism based solely on one word, Yun, which completely shut down all conversations. And thus the focus continues to be on the Khmer Rouge era, to dominate all the conversations in any other parts of history of Cambodia. And now it's being assisted by the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and for a long time now by the Yale Genocide program. And of course, the young writers on Cambodia who do not know anything except for what they experienced in Cambodia and present day history, and the lack of writings on this era because the US war fatigue in Southeast Asia, and that once the US left, all the major news outlets also left. Some of the reasons, unintentional, unwittingly intentional, manipulated by Vietnam to further the narrative of the Khmer Rouge because it feeds into their policies of Vietnamization of Cambodia. Okay, so this is the Paris Peace Agreement. and the overview with some details, please go and read the Paris Peace Agreement on Cambodia. It's not long. You can read in about an hour. An hour. Go to the USIP, United States Institute for Peace website. It has a cleaner version of the agreement. You can also read from the United Nations website in all the different languages, but it's in a font and a screenshot of the PDF of that era, which is a little bit tricky and a little bit difficult to read for us modern people who are used to newer fonts. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for following and for coming to join this special seminar on the Paris Peace Agreement on Cambodia in the English language. Have a good day. God bless.